Perfect. So yeah, my name is Janelle Thornton. I am an instructor at DMAC with Student Support Services, which primarily means I work in the Academic Achievement Center in the Writing Lab, but I do also teach Student Support Service courses like STV 108 and 115. And then I actually do dip over a little bit into the English department and teach some Lit 101 and Comp 106. So I'm kind of across a lot of things, but the main place you can find me is in the Writing Lab in the Academic Achievement Center. But I have recently gotten more invested in understanding and talking about and learning more about neurodiversity in a college setting. And so this presentation is kind of an adaptation of a presentation I gave actually at a conference for fellow college educators that I have kind of tweaked to be the same kind of general information, but then the last portion being rather than strategies for educators, strategies for students. So some of that draws from some of like my study strategies kind of courses, things like that, but also just again from the same body of research. So yeah, and just like Paige said, if at any point you have questions or comments, please feel free to stop me. I may also occasionally jump in for polling and just kind of see if it makes sense or if you have questions. But yeah, we'll go from there. So the first kind of place to start is why I called this Too Many Tabs Open as kind of my starting title. Because there's this kind of running joke on the internet you've probably seen, right? This idea that like my brain's like an internet browser, I have all these tabs open, there's music playing, there's a GIF going, I don't know how to turn it off, right? And I think we've all been there to some degree where you just feel like there's too much in your head all the time for it to kind of be reasonable. But this is a very vivid experience for neurodiverse individuals, where literally there's just more sometimes that your brain is doing, whether that's just taking in extra stimulation or just many like thoughts, like all of that kind of happening. And there is this feeling sometimes that like you have all these tabs open and how do you sort of control them? So yeah, that's kind of the like framing idea I had for this, was thinking about, what do we do with this feeling sometimes of all these tabs being open and not being sure how to sort of process. So yeah, it starts with just understanding what I mean by the term neurodiversity. You may have heard this term before, it's becoming a little bit more well-known, but it is still relatively new. It was coined by sociologist Judy Singer in '99, who essentially came up with the idea of neurodiversity as the explanation that all brains function differently, and that just like diversity in any other element of humanity, diversity in brain function is just a kind of natural and beneficial part of our species. So everyone is under the umbrella of neurodiverse, just because that's again saying everyone's brains work a little differently, but we then tend to break it neurotypical and neurodivergent. So a neurotypical individual would have brain functioning that society kind of considers normal or more typical, right? What we kind of assume is how the brain works. Versus neurodivergent brain functioning, the term divergent, to diverge, right, goes away from that kind of assumption of typicality. So that's the kind of first word we're thinking about and framing here. And there are a number of things that fall under this umbrella of neurodiversity, everything does, right? But specifically under neurodivergence, most commonly, we hear this term used for things like autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it covers actually a much wider range of things than that. Neurodivergency also includes things like dyslexia and dyscalculia, mental health conditions or genetic disorders, some of them. But again, it's a blurry sort of category. Basically, does your brain kind of function a little differently than the norm, different than we kind of assume, then you're likely under this neurodivergent umbrella. So that's the kind of idea here. So here I might do my first little like polling of just how many of you know someone who is neurodivergent. Now this could be you, or it could be a friend or a family member or anything like that. But how many of you have encountered these kinds of terms and this kind of neurodivergent individual before? And you can just like throw the little like hand raise up or whatever you want to do.
Shelby said that she has.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's becoming kind of more and more common because it's becoming better understood, right? We have more terminology for it and we have more ways of kind of discussing it. And it also is important because neurodiversity and being neurodivergent are, again, trying to kind of end some of this stigma about how brains function, right? So neurodivergency is really looking at that, like cognitive differences are to be accepted and valued rather than pathologies to be cured. And this goes against what is sometimes called the medical model of disability, which is the one through most of history was kind of the assumption about disability. That disability itself is a physical or mental condition, it's intrinsic to a person. The condition itself reduces a person's quality of life and offers them a clear disadvantage. That's why within the medical model, the idea is often to try to fix these disabilities, fix kind of in quotes. So you can see it in the little diagram I have for you over here that I found, where the idea that the individual with the disability sort of is the problem. So this is kind of the conventional idea. But neurodiversity and that understanding of neurodivergence instead connects to what's called the social model of disability, which is the idea that disability isn't inherent in a person, but it's created by an environment that was not built to accommodate or support them. So rather than the problem being the person, the problem is the environment, right? Because society is made for and by non-disabled individuals, if you don't fit into that, then you are inherently disabled. An example of this would be that a person in a wheelchair is not disabled because they need to use a wheelchair, but because the environment around them isn't actually built to meet their needs. They don't have accessibility. They can't get to the places they need to, things like that. That's not on the fault of them needing that device. It is the fault of the social structure that wasn't built to accommodate them. And this is the same model that gets used for understanding neurodivergency as well. Rather than thinking about things like autism and ADHD as things that need to be fixed because there is something wrong with the person and we need to fix them so they can function in society, the social model instead says, no, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just a part of human diversity. And what matters is fixing the environment around you to better actually meet your needs. Now, some of that obviously comes from the individual figuring out what they need, what kind of accommodations, what environments work for them. But the big thing is about changing or revising the environment rather than the person. Is that making sense? Do we have any questions or anything about these kind of models of disability and what they mean? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Okay, so we'll keep going. But again, if you end up having questions or anything like that, you can always stop me. We can come back. But yeah, so again, this idea of looking at neurodiversity and neurodivergent seeks to kind of reframe how we think of being neurodivergent and recognizing instead that it's not a problem a person has, but instead is just a difference. And there are strengths and skills connected to it. And there are ways in which you can succeed, right? That all brains work differently. Even if we categorize them sometimes in like similar kind of constructions, all brains are diverse, right? And so a lot of it comes down to making environments that better apply to all kinds of learners. And that's kind of the focus of this discussion too, is so much of what helps someone who's neurodivergent also helps anyone as a learner. So that's kind of the idea. But yeah, you'll sometimes hear like, oh, you know, people never used to be autistic back in the past. Like, we didn't have this kind of ADHD when I was younger, or whatever it is. This idea that like neurodivergency is like a new thing. But while the statistics are hard to find exactly, there is odds that like anywhere between 15 to 30% of the population is in fact neurodivergent in some way. And that again, people likely have been to that percentage for a very long time. Right? The trickiness kind of in getting these exact statistics is there's kind of that blur of boundaries within that umbrella. Criteria to diagnose someone changes through time. Individuals may not be willing to disclose their neurodivergent or may not even know. But yeah, you'll sometimes hear people say like that this is just, it's becoming popular. People just want it for attention, or just, because they're using it as an excuse or whatever it is. But I would not argue in that capacity at all. I instead like to refer to this little chart here about left-handedness over the course of history. Now, if you look at this chart, you're like, wow, crazy. Suddenly, a whole bunch more people were left-handed, right? And then it kind of stabilized again. What was happening? Did a bunch of people magically decide they wanted to be left-handed? No. What happened was that left-handedness became less stigmatized. People weren't forced to use their right hands if that wasn't what they were naturally strong at, right? Like it wasn't a problem you had to fix being left-handed. So of course, once we're losing that kind of stigma, that kind of legitimate penalty that would happen sometimes, of course, more people then are able to recognize in themselves that they would be left-handed, are able to use it more, etc. And I would say it's the same thing with something like neurodivergency. As we move away from this kind of stigmatization, we get clearer terms and definitions, there is more availability of resources, you have more people then finally able to recognize within themselves neurodivergency and be safely able to share that about themselves. And so I think you're seeing a similar kind of chart with neurodivergency. It's not that there's suddenly a bunch more, it's that suddenly more people are actually able to identify in that way. So yeah, that's my kind of explanation for you there. Let me see. Oh, there we go. Little thing keeps being in the way, and I was trying to figure out how to move it, and I got rid of it. Okay. So, any questions, thoughts, concerns kind of at this point?
Anybody? Shelby sounds like she's good. Anybody else have any questions? Comments, concerns, anything you want to add? All right, I think they're good.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's keep going then. Great. It's just always kind of weird with virtual classes because I can't like see all of you. So I have to just kind of hope we're all in the same place. But yeah, awesome. So hopefully this is all making sense. We've got this kind of terminology, these ideas of how we consider disability, all of that. But there are still added challenges to kind of understanding and categorizing neurodiversity and neurodivergence, especially with certain things like ADHD and autism. ADHD can be especially challenging because for so much of history, literally up until the early 90s, early 1980s, those are the numbers I'm trying to say, there was actually a belief that ADHD only affected children, that somehow kids would hit like puberty or early adulthood and they would be cured. Magically it was gone. So they're like, oh, this is just a childhood disability that we have to learn to sort of manage because they're problem children, right? Well, obviously we know now this is not true, right? Like your ADHD doesn't magically go away. What happens is as you grow up and continue being in school and interacting with people, you learn how to cope with it, right? You figure out how to kind of live with this and manage it in a structure that isn't built for you. But because there was this belief for so long, there's very little research still on like adults with ADHD or lifelong ADHD and managing it or dealing with it, living with it, those kinds of things. So it's still kind of this new concept. And then obviously we see something similar with autism, this kind of infantilization, right? Viewing them kind of as like children or mentally handicapped or slow or any of these kinds of, now we know to be somewhat incorrect assumptions, right? And then there's the continued discussion of what causes autism or how it can be cured, which obviously is not real in either capacity. But because of these frequent sort of roadblocks, it's kind of like we're starting on the back foot, really trying to like understand it and have good research for it. There's also an additional challenge that neurodivergency tends to have comorbidities with other mental illnesses. And comorbidity just means that these things tend to go together. If you have ADHD, there's a likelihood you also have anxiety and or depression, right? For whatever reason, those things tend to go together in your brain, right? So there's that additional challenge in both, diagnoses and understanding it, as well as just the challenge of, just having anxiety and depression in itself is challenging. And then you add something like ADHD or autism onto it, and that's difficult. There's also some overlap that tends to happen with other marginalized groups. Like there is for whatever reason, higher percentage of people who are neurodivergent are also part of the LGBTQ plus community. There's some overlap there that seems to happen. There's also a tendency towards like learning disabilities, right? Like things that already add additional difficulties to kind of learning and understanding. And that doesn't even take into account other like intersectionalities of difference a person might deal with. And that just means other elements of like human diversity that come with their challenges. So things like race, class, anything like that, when you then overlap that with neurodivergency, with mental illness, with, anything like that, you get these kind of broader challenges that individuals have to face. So yeah. So by the time people are getting to college, right? At this point, if you're getting to college, right, you're able to like get in and you're going to school and you've graduated high school and whatever else, like typically at that point, you have clearly learned strategies that have sort of helped you function so far. You've figured out whatever it is you need to do to get by, right? But then sometimes we get students coming into a college setting, which is very different. Or maybe they don't have the same kind of support systems they had before, and suddenly they're kind of ill-equipped to succeed in this environment, right? So because of struggles built into having something like neurodivergency, like executive functioning, emotional regulation, this can heighten when you're then also in an unfamiliar and more challenging environment like higher education. So all of these sorts of factors can add to the challenge of being a neurodivergent learner in higher education, right? Because you're coming in with all these additional challenges anyway, and then you're in a more difficult environment. And again, you're kind of grappling with still a lack of kind of understanding and knowledge about these things. And that for a lot of people, this is still kind of new to learn and understand what neurodivergency is and how it works and why it matters. So that's kind of these larger challenges to understanding this. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything, so I'm assuming we're good. So I'm going to keep going. Another major challenge that I think is important sort of to address, because a lot of people don't really know this term or don't know what it means, is that many neurodivergent people with ADHD or autism or anything like that, learn essentially what is called masking, which is actions or coping strategies you use in order to better meet societal expectations, right? You kind of figure out how to conceal things that aren't as socially acceptable about yourself in order to kind of better fit in. So on one hand, this is good because like people might think you're higher functioning, or you might fit in a little more easily, but doing this kind of masking takes a lot of physical and mental energy, right? So energy you could be putting to something like learning or studying or homework, you're instead having to try to put towards just maintaining this mask, right? And so it's harder because if you're not masking, maybe you're more outwardly disruptive or different, but at least you don't have to expend the energy to keep that mask on. And so, yeah, the example I give of this, because I do myself have ADHD, is I'm a very, if you couldn't tell already, very kind of movementy, fidgety kind of person, right? It's very much like how I exist in the world. So can I sit perfectly still and not move around and not talk with my hands and not fidget with anything? Yes, I can. But does it take a lot of concentrated effort that I don't really want to use if I don't have to? Also, yes. So the experience of masking, and this is my silly example, but it often can just kind of feel like this. You're the little dog in the burning room and you're just saying, this is fine, right? Like, it's good. I'm in control of it. Nothing's happening, whatever. Even though really, it is not a good and safe and comfortable environment. So yeah, that's an additional challenge people deal with. Because again, by the time you've kind of gotten to higher ed, many of us have learned some level of this kind of masking technique. And I do think there's a certain level of masking that all people do, depending on the situation. But there's, I think, a more extreme example of it for someone who is neurodivergent. So, yeah. all of this is essentially to say, like, why did I personally start looking at this and kind of figuring it out? And yes, if you can see my cursor, this is little fifth grade me over there who grew up neurodivergent but was never diagnosed. I very clearly had symptoms of ADHD. My parents will tell you that, right? The hyperactivity, the difficulty with follow through, the being distractible, being very fidgety, distracting others with like talking and moving around, right? But one, because I was a girl, and especially historically, they just did not diagnose girls with ADHD because the image was some hyperactive little boy who couldn't sit still, right? Because I was a girl, and also because I did do well enough in school, like I could figure out how to get by. I enjoyed enough of the learning process that I could focus, things like that. I just never got an official diagnosis or accommodations until I was literally in my 20s. And some of this really did come to a head in college. I had to start grappling with and recognizing, like, okay, why don't I learn the same as other people? Why is this so much harder for me in some ways? And so it was learning a lot of coping strategies that were kind of more or less functional. So things that were good, like note taking and organization, and finding those kinds of strategies that worked for me, as well as finding some, both good and bad ways of stimming. And we'll talk more about stimming in a later slide, but essentially it just means the kind of little movements all humans kind of do to get out excess energy or express like emotion if we're restless or nervous or things like that. We'll talk a bit more, but I was very much a stimmer and still am. And then also learning to mask, though I didn't know that's what it was, right? So I had to learn to function in an educational environment that very clearly wasn't suited for me. So as I then decided to go into education myself, and teaching at a college level, first teaching English and then here getting into student support services, I've always had a really big emphasis on teaching to a wider range of learners and trying to offer a lot of clarity and accessibility that I would have needed and benefited from as a student, right? So coming at it from this kind of different perspective. And the more I've done that, people have responded really well to it. And so it's been kind of amazing to actually get to be openly neurodivergent at my job and have that not be a bad thing, right? That this can be a benefit because I bring a different kind of thinking, because I can, understand and relate to students who are also kind of like me. So yeah, all of that has led me into this doing further research and really kind of developing beyond just my own lived experience. So yeah, that is kind of how this all came about and where it came from and why I try to speak to this. Oh, I lost my whole page there. Try to speak to this as both an educator, but also as like a student, right? As someone who has been, not from the beginning, there we go, has been that student, right? Who didn't quite fit into the traditional educational environment and didn't really know why either. So yeah, we're still good, making sense? Thoughts or questions that anybody has at this point?
Brianna was saying that she's really resonating with the things that you're saying.
Yeah.
That she really thinks that she can see a lot of this in herself.
Yeah, and sometimes that's what it is, right? And I think that's again why more people are starting to be able to recognize and diagnose with neurodivergency, because they're seeing it, because there's terms for it, because people are more open about it rather than it being this kind of hidden, shameful sort of thing. Like you just have to pretend you're normal, quote unquote. So yes, absolutely. If these things are resonating, regardless of if you go get a diagnosis or anything like that, it's just good to know about yourself, right? To know that maybe you learn a little differently, that maybe your brain works a little bit differently. And also that that's not a bad thing. And even if there are challenges, there are also ways to make it work, right? And you absolutely can still be very successful in anything, right? So no, I love that. I definitely hope this is useful for many people, right? So I love that. And also, yeah, if you are ever, I don't know how many of you are actually on DMAC campus, and I'm up on Ankeny campus, but I have lots of students who come to me because I've kind of become the neurodivergent whisperer, like, hey, that one also has ADHD, right? And so I'll work with students with things like study skills or test prep or things like that they've struggled with because it's been neurotypical instructors telling them how to do it, and that just doesn't work the way they think. Not that everything I suggest will work for each individual person either, but I like to think I can kind of offer a little bit of difference that might help some people more. So yes, you're always welcome to seek me out, email me, stop in and see me, anything if you want to talk about any of this further. So no, that's great. I love that. Let's see if this is going to work for me. So yeah, the last part of this that I've kind of compiled are just these strategies and tips and tricks for being kind of a neurodivergent learner and really being successful in the college environment. But these are tips that I also think apply to anybody, right? Because a lot of it is about figuring out what works for you, right? Getting rid of any of that preconceived idea of how you are supposed to learn or study or engage with material or anything like that. Because the only actual right way is the way that actually works for you, right? So that's why, neurodivergent or not, a lot of this hopefully will still apply to kind of helping you, again, feel more confident and be a more kind of successful student and learner. So yeah, my first point here for anybody is just the seeking out of acceptance, whether that is that you are neurodivergent and you want to know that you are somewhere safe and supported, or if you know people around you who are neurodivergent and want to make sure they know that they are safe and supported. It's great for anybody to just, again, have this recognition and understanding of what neurodivergency is, so that we can undercut some of this shame or like hiding or, like unfamiliarity. So just knowing some of these basic terminologies and concepts and practices can just have a really positive benefit for anybody. It's also the interesting thing of kind of recognizing things like identity first language, in contrast to sort of traditional disability languages that tends to use people first, which is great, right? Saying like, a person with Down syndrome, right? Or something like that. Often, though, people who are neurodivergent actually prefer that identity first. So saying I'm an autistic person, or like I've even been using, I'm a neurodivergent learner, things like that, because it's the idea that this is in fact part of your identity, right? It's not something separate that can be kind of separated from you just as a person, right? Obviously, it's a little hard with ADHD. There's not really a good way to say, like, I guess an ADHD person, but this sounds slightly strange. But it's, again, just kind of a lot of it is knowing those terms, finding kind of safe people and accommodations, being a safe person, all just makes for a better community for everyone as like an individual and a learner. So that's kind of why that's my first point. It's great for all of us to have some knowledge of these concepts and these terms. So yeah, the next then is to really be aware of and utilize services and accommodations. Now, neurodivergent students may or may not identify with the concept of disability, may not know they have access to disability services, like may have never received accommodations. And even if they did receive accommodations, like study shows that only about 24% go on to disclose these in higher education. So there is a challenge and a barrier there. But these kinds of like student services are so important for anyone to know about, any of these helpful resources, because campus has so many things to just make your life as a student easier. And any student can benefit from knowing that they have access to free tutoring, either from a peer or from faculty, and can benefit from knowing there are student support service resources and assistive technology and study spaces and things like that that are just beneficial to anyone, right? But especially to someone who's coming in as a different kind of learner. So I just gave the kind of little screen clip over here. This is if you go kind of under student resources to this helpful links page. This just gives you such a nice breakdown of all the things available just to try to help you. So we've obviously got things like the Academic Achievement Center, which is where I work and that I love very much because, again, I love working with students, but it also really is just free faculty drop-in tutoring. But then there's also things like, knowing you have an advisor and that it's someone you can talk to about your classes, knowing that there's like a career center to help you with those questions, or childcare if you have kind of that additional difficulty of being a parent, right? Even things like counseling, right? That is a thing that's available as well if you are having difficulty with mental health issues or emotions or stress or things like that. There are just so many resources available, and they are free to you and they're out there. And it just takes that kind of first step of seeking them out and then taking advantage of them, because they're there to just help you succeed for anybody. So I think I asked this the last time I presented, but I might ask it again just out of curiosity. How many of you have utilized some kind of student service, whether that is, again, in like your high school or at DMAC or anything like that? You've worked with an advisor or used the library or, gone to a campus event even, or something like that. Any of you have used some kind of student service? And again, you can always just do your little, like, pop that little hand raise thing up.
Blanca said that she has, and so has Shelby.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, because again, the first step is just recognizing and knowing they're there, which I feel like so many people just don't. They don't realize just how much is available, right? And also then just taking advantage, knowing that it's there for you. So that's a huge one. I encourage everyone to take advantage of. The next point then, and this again may sound a little self-explanatory, but I think is very important, is this focusing on detail and clarity, right? Really looking for answers to your questions and concerns and really utilizing the class-specific resources you're given. Now, hopefully, if your instructor is doing their job, they're putting things up on your online course page. They're giving you handouts of assignment sheets or homework or schedules or things like that, right? And if those are there, take advantage of them, use them, keep them places you can easily find, right? There's no reason to try to spend time or energy tracking these things down if you're ready to put your time or energy into actually doing work. So knowing where those are, having them ready to go. And then here's where we get into some of that self-advocacy and understanding yourself, is to also notice if there are things that aren't there or things you're not finding or understanding, reach out to your instructor, right? Let them know, ask for clarification, ask for something in writing. Simple things like that. Your instructor should be able to provide written instructions, should be able to explain ideas or requirements to you in a different way, should be able to give you PowerPoints they use in class so you can access them again, should have office hours where you're available to talk in person. These are all things everyone should be doing as a teacher. And so again, if those kinds of things aren't there, ask and seek them out. And then also remember to, again, self-advocate in the sense of, if there are certain ways that make more sense for your brain to complete an assignment versus others, ask if those are options, right? Is it essential that you do something handwritten versus typed, right? Is there a certain order in which you have to complete something or not? Being flexible and asking for that kind of flexibility is a great thing to do, right? Because your instructors want you to succeed, or at least they should. And I love DMAC, and I really do think everyone here wants you to do well and succeed. So then some of it is, again, just advocating for yourself and your learning, knowing what you need and asking for it. And so then as you're doing that, once you have those resources, taking the time to use them and to really make them work and make sense for you personally. So if you say are given an assignment sheet for an essay and it's just a big block of a paragraph of text like this, and you're like, well, I can't find in that what I need quickly, I don't know what the requirements are, it's just bogged down with terms and ideas, that's totally fair, because though there are assignment sheets out there that are just messy and confusing. So then the trick is to understand how to break them down for yourself, right? And this is such an important tip I give students too for with exam taking. That was a strange way to phrase that. But if you are given short answer questions or essay questions on exams, to take the time to break down what the question is really asking you for. So if you've got this big kind of description, going through and just sort of highlighting, first of all, okay, what are the important things that I need to take out of this to make sure I'm meeting requirements? And then possibly even bulleting those things into a list that you can quickly and easily find and access, right? So instead of trying to scan this whole paragraph for, what type of argument am I supposed to make? We've got bullets, so we know, oh, it's a persuasive argument. I have to do these things. And just taking the time to do that for yourself, make it easier for yourself and make sure you understand. And then if there are things that you still don't, asking your instructor. And it's much easier to get good feedback if you can come in specifically saying, hey, you're saying to take, explain, and defend a position, but I don't entirely understand what that means. Could you tell me more about that? Rather than just coming in and saying, like, I don't understand this assignment. So taking that time to kind of, again, break things down for yourself is really helpful. And you can do that with anything, right? This one's even a little clearer, but there's still just a big block of information. So maybe I do want to make sure it's broken down. I know what kind it is and where to access it, how long it's supposed to be, all of this. And maybe I even make myself like an in order little to-do list of what I have to do based on the assignment prompt, right? I know I have to pick a topic, I got to make an argument, then I should start looking for sources, doing those kinds of things that make the process clearer and easier for you. And again, this is especially helpful if you're neurodivergent, but I think all students benefit from doing this. The amount of times in my English classes where I've had students write lovely, thoughtful papers that just don't meet the requirement and thus can't get as good of a grade is way too frequent. It makes me very sad, right? Because like a big part of it is that you can read and understand directions. So taking the extra time to be sure you're doing that is a huge tip and benefit I would give to anyone, especially someone who is neurodivergent in some way. All right, so those are my first 3 tips. Any questions, thoughts, concerns there? I'm just trying to flip through and make sure. All right, it looks like we're good. So yeah, let's keep going. Okay, so my next tip, again, for anyone, but especially for neurodivergent learners, is knowing your due dates. Instead of having, a syllabus or a schedule for each class separate and somewhere that hopefully you find and check, collect everything into one place. And now sometimes this is that kind of the advice they'll give people with ADHD. Well, just keep a planner, which yes, I see the intent of that advice, right? But for a lot of people, a traditional paper planner doesn't work, right? Because you just like, you won't remember to pick it up or do anything with it. It's just kind of there. So that's why I don't emphasize having a planner. I emphasize just having everything collected in one place. I am a huge fan myself of using my phone for this and using my phone calendar. Because unlike a paper planner, my phone calendar can make noise at me when I need to remember stuff, can have multiple alarms set. It can do these kinds of things that really help me know when I need to get things done and what's happening and all of that. So it's just figuring out what version of this kind of collection of all of those big due dates works best for you. There are also tons and tons of apps and things you can use. I gave you this little screen clip over here from an article that was about like the best apps for ADHD, right? If you're trying to plan. So it's again that level of creativity. So don't dismiss the, suggestion of having a planner out of hand, but recognize that it means figuring out one that works for you, right? Whatever that may be. And it may depend on each individual person, but it is hugely helpful to not have to spend time and energy hunting down due dates and assignments and things like that if you can just have them all in one place. So whatever this is, whatever you choose to do, putting it in somewhere, you are forced to look at or notice it, whatever that is. Again, if you're like me and that means literally making your phone make noise at you to remind you of stuff, excellent. This could be as simple as like setting some kind of alarm to daily or weekly check your Canvas pages to make sure you're staying up to date with the course page. It could be as, old school as just having a Post-it you put on your laptop screen that reminds you to check your planner. And if you're like me with ADHD at all, you'd have to move it around, so that it doesn't just acclimate to the environment. But it's just whatever version of this works for you so that you've got all of your due dates in one place and you can quickly and easily access and remember them. Because you don't want to be, this little guy down here who is constantly stressed because you've forgotten things. My next advice then is to add any kind of multisensory learning that you can. A lot of neurodivergent learners struggle if it is purely auditory learning, so meaning just listening to something and then remembering and using it. This is a huge one for me. I like to just confess to students, if you put me in a room with nothing in it and we're like, listen to this podcast, and then there will be a test, I would probably not do great at that, because that is just not how my brain functions, to just take in and listen to information and be able to then be tested on it. So that's why you bring in additional kinds of, solutions and strategies that fill those gaps. If you're like me and struggle with just sitting in a lecture and listening to the instructor talk, well, then that's not going to work, and to try something else. That's why I'm a really big fan of like note taking during class, whatever those notes look like, no matter how messy they are, whatever it is. Just the very act of writing has been proven in research, and just the act of taking notes has been proven that students learn more and retain more. Because something about adding that element of kinesthetic learning, that you are physically writing, you're using the muscles in your hands, as well as then having visual elements of like seeing what's being written down as you're hearing it. All of that helps us to learn and remember more, even if we then never do anything with the notes later. Just the act of doing it helps us learn and remember. But it can be anything when you're learning and studying. Does it help to be able to like print out the instructor's PowerPoint so you can jot notes on those to yourself? Do you like having a whiteboard that you can just, sketch ideas out for yourself, or draw diagrams, or do whatever? It can even be as simple as things like, if you have audio or video you have to watch or listen to, can you add closed captioning so you can also read along with it? Right? And then you can also start getting more creative. Can you read things aloud? Can you act them out? Can you discuss with other people? Can you do color coding? Like whatever it is. There is an expectation sometimes, like you need to sit quietly and read your textbook, and you need to just sit there and be able to absorb a lecture. But that's really not true, right? Like if sitting and just staring at your textbook doesn't work for your brain, then just do something else. There are always other things you can do. If just sitting silently in a lecture you don't remember and can't focus, then do something else. So that's that, again, like awareness and self-advocacy of saying like, okay, this thing doesn't work for me. And that's fine, because not everything works for everybody. But if that thing doesn't work, I'm not just going to keep trying to do it and banging my head against the wall. I'm going to do something else over here. And that's a huge strategy to just do, to start getting comfortable with the idea of like, I don't have to do it a certain way. I'm going to figure out the way that works for me. So that's a big one. Similar to this sort of need for maybe multisensory kind of stuff is also possibly a need to kind of work out sensory needs. So obviously this has to be done in a way that is appropriate and not distracting to other students or making it harder for anyone else to learn. But if you are having a challenge of needing this sort of sensory stimuli, or you're dealing with masking and it's just making it really hard to learn, this is where that idea of stimming comes in. And it's a term we use. I think it just comes from the term stimulation. And it's that idea of repetitive motions a person uses to release this excess energy, And everyone does this to some degree. People who bite their nails, tap their legs, pace because they're nervous, or on the phone, fidgeting with your clothes, your hair, right? All of that is just kind of being a person. But neurodivergent individuals tend to stim more frequently and have more of a need to get that kind of like excessive energy and movement out. So it's figuring out, non-distracting but functional ways to do this in the classroom. So I always like to give my example. I wear sometimes, when I remember to, my little black ring here that, I don't know if you can see, but it spins, right? So it just looks like jewelry, but I can be sitting with it in my lap, spinning or fidgeting with it. And it doesn't look terribly distracting. It's not, it's nothing big and bright and colorful, but it gives me something to do with my hands. Because if I don't have anything to do with my hands, I'm much more restless, or I find more distracting things to do, right? So it's figuring out those kinds of things. There are lots of, fidget toys and devices and jewelry and things like that you can find. It's, again, finding ones that are appropriate to a classroom setting. It can even be as simple as just figuring out what kind of movements you can do. Does it help you to just kind of like have a little bit of rocking or leg motion, or little things like that, or even to like share with your instructor, like, hey, I have autism or whatever, and I have issues sometimes with overstimulation. Is it okay if sometimes I need to get up and leave the classroom for a second? And I can't imagine instructors being like, no, you are not allowed to do that, right? Like, especially if you are communicating clearly with them. And this can similarly be with accommodations. Do you need to be able to wear headphones or like those little earplugs that a friend of mine has who is autistic that like block out some extra sound, right? So that she's better able to focus and doesn't get overstimulated. Like those kinds of sensory issues. Even things like, can you have kind of like a food and drink in the classroom if you need that to help you focus? And have some of these go to safe stims. Simple things like, again, my fidget kind of jewelry, stress balls, and then, yeah, as simple sensory things, even as like mint and gum. You're doing something, then you have something else that's being stimulating. And then that even goes actually into a weird little study trick, which is that if you chew the same flavor gum or have the same flavor mint or something as you're studying, and then you use that same one during a test, you've kind of created memory passages in your brain between those associations. And so you sometimes find it easier on the test because your brain's like, ooh, the spearmint gum again. I guess we're learning this subject, and you're just like ready to go. So there's so many strategies. Once again, if something isn't working, if you are struggling with something, just remembering that there's always additional strategies. There's always things you can find and figure out. And so understanding what stimming is, understanding your sensory needs, and finding ways to work around them in the classroom rather than just masking or suppressing or being uncomfortable or being distracting, right? Having these kinds of things can be hugely beneficial and helpful. So
Janelle, so Blanca put in the chat that she has like a fidget on her keychain.
perfect. Yeah, I love that. And that's so easy to have now. There are so many options for that of little things like that. Yeah, keychains are great because, again, they're right there for you. I've seen people have them on like necklaces, things you can just keep in your pocket. So, yeah, I love that. That's such a great idea. And again, there are so many options everywhere that are very inexpensive, very accessible. So, yeah, that's great. Yeah, is there anything else happening that I have missed in the chat or in comments or anything?
Well, I would just like to take a second to chime in on a couple of things.
Yeah, please.
So first of all, one thing would be going back to what you were saying about instructors accommodating this need. If any of my students would ever bring something like this to my attention, I would always be very accommodating. Like, get up, go take a walk, go do jumping jacks, a cartwheel, get something to drink, like do whatever you have to do. And
Yeah.
then I know we had talked about I have a child who kind of struggles with this same topic, and her teacher, she's in elementary school, but her teacher will say to her, like, if you need to go take a walk around the halls, that's okay. Like, so in my experience, teachers have always been pretty accommodating, especially in recent history.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think a big part of that is just if you are communicating clearly and being honest with your instructor, it's so easy to accommodate. I think the issue just comes when your instructor doesn't know what's going on, right? Like if your instructor doesn't know why you keep getting up and leaving or things like that. If you just talk to them, yeah, it's so easy to accommodate. And I think, yeah, instructors are more than willing to. It's often just needing to kind of know what's going on and what you need, right? Because otherwise, your instructor's up there with 20 other students in front of them and they don't know. So, yeah, I love that. But yeah, so again, a lot of this too is that communication. That's the same thing with asking for clarity or asking for different kinds of assignments, or resources. Like a lot of it is that the bravery sometimes needed to talk to people and seek it out and be honest. It's not like you have to go up and be like, hi, I have ADHD and I need this thing. You could just say like, hey, I sometimes need to get up and walk around during class. Is that okay? Like you don't have to be disclosing anyone's medical history in order to be clear and communicative with instructors. So yeah, that is excellent. So yeah, the last point I have, this number 7, is just to focus on your strengths. Being neurodivergent can be really challenging, right? I have personally dealt with that it can be difficult, right? The times when my executive function gets really bad and I'm like, I want to do things, I know I need to do things, and I just like can't get over the hurdle of doing them. And that sucks, right? Like those things happen and they suck. But far too often historically, that's all people have looked at with neurodivergency. Oh, it's a problem, it's a difficulty. These, again, children can't learn right or can't sit still or do whatever. And they've forgotten that there are also benefits to these things. There are benefits to having a diverse group of people and learners, right? There's a benefit to having people who look at the world differently or engage with things differently. That's great. Like, that's diversity enlivens the human experience in general, and the same goes for neurodiversity. So working to then identify and focus on your strengths instead of those deficiencies can really be hugely beneficial to shifting your focus and kind of building your confidence. So it's, again, that self-knowledge and that self-advocacy. What are the advantages actually of your neurodivergency? What things are you good at because of that? Or what things do you bring to the table that are cool and interesting and helpful, right? And also, how can you just learn to shift that focus to not what's still hard or still not working or still difficult, but instead, what is going well? What are you great at, right? Like, what strengths do you have? And this is, again, important for anyone, anybody, any kind of learner, any kind of person. Just this idea of awareness of our self-talk. And this might sound a little, like woo-woo, whatever, but it's true, right? It's just genuinely true that the way we speak to ourselves mentally really does shape reality. Right? Like, our brains can't tell the difference between us joking or being disparaging or lying and reality. So if you just keep saying something to yourself over and over and over, your brain's like, oh, that must be true. So if you're in a constant loop of saying things like, this is too hard, I can't do it, I'll never be good at this, like, I've never been good at math, I'm never going to be able to learn this, whatever, you're setting yourself up for that self-fulfilling prophecy. Your brain's going, oh, that must be true then. We must not be able to do this, which is obviously not true, right? You're all capable of doing whatever you want to do, right? So it can start with just catching some of that self-talk and being aware of it. Are you speaking to yourself in that way? Or are you speaking to yourself kindly, right? Even if you're struggling, can you reframe this in your own mind? Instead of things like, this is too hard, I can't do this, things like, this is really hard right now, but I'm working on it. Or, okay, I can't do this yet, but I'm trying, right? Like, it's those little shifts to then hopefully get to a point you can say, like, no, I'm capable, I'm intelligent, I can do this, I got this, it's fine, right? Whatever it is. Because the more we tell ourselves that, whether we believe it or not at first, our brain starts to absorb it. I like to give the personal example of this, that I was teaching a study strategies class, and we've been talking a lot about mindset and self-talk and all these things and how important it was. And I had not been consciously going, I'm going to work on my self-talk, right? But I'd been talking about it and engaging with students with it. So I had one day where something had gone wrong, something like stupid and frustrating. And my brain, because I have ADHD and anxiety and depression, tried to go into this loop of like, see, you can't ever do anything right. You're never good at this kind of whatever kind of stuff. And my brain actually went, wait, no, that's not true. That's not right. I do stuff well usually. And it was just in there, literally just because I'd been thinking about and talking about self-talk and mindset with my students. I caught it myself unintentionally, just like had that moment of notice of like, oh, I shouldn't be saying it like this. This isn't actually reality. So I just love that example of just like, it really is in there and it works, right? Whether you think you're intentionally doing it or not. But having these kinds of things, whether it's just catching that kind of self-talk, putting, visual positive reminders on your phone, like in Post-its, in planners, wherever, so that you are emphasizing and reading these positive sorts of things can make a really big difference in how we interact with the world around us and how well we do at tasks and learning and things like that. So yeah, that is my last point for anybody, but especially someone who's neurodivergent or with mental health issues. So yeah, the overall idea of all of this, if you could take kind of the boiled down idea, is just to recognize that neurodivergency is more common and more complex than we often assume. There are going to be neurodivergent people around us, right? The world is full of diversity and difference, and the better we recognize and understand it, the better just kind of people we will be, right? Helps us to become better, stronger thinkers, more thoughtful individuals. We break down assumptions about who can kind of be a successful college student. And then again, the recognition and memory that like every student can be successful, right? You are all fully capable of being successful and meeting your goals, too many tabs open or not. So that is my kind of little rundown for you there. If you are interested, since again, this was an academic presentation, I do in fact have a works cited for you. So if you're interested in any of these things, I am a huge advocate, obviously, of doing your own research, looking at it, if you're like, oh, those models of disability are really interesting. You can look them up. If you're like, ooh, neurodiversity tips in college. Like the information and research is out there. And then I have my little works consulted as well. But yeah, that is the overall kind of idea I've got for you. Do you have any questions or comments at this point?
So I have something that I want to add for sure. In addition to just saying thank you so much for having this conversation and for being here to share with us.
Yeah.
We had kind of talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I think that it's important to circle back around and give this example. So I just want to tell you all that if this is something that seems like is resonating with you, or if these are things that maybe you have been diagnosed or not diagnosed with, or that you just seem to kind of struggle with feeling a little bit different, then I want to definitely take away the idea that it's a bad thing. Like you kind of talked about how it's like a label or almost a stigma or something. And I just would really like to challenge that. I don't think that it's a bad thing to have your brain work in a way that's unique to you. And what I think is a bad thing is that you're forced to try to operate in a system that's not necessarily catering to the needs that you have no way of controlling or that you didn't choose. So we kind of gave the example yesterday about how I was trying to homeschool my children during COVID. Then one of them is left-handed, and all the rest of us in the house are right-handed. And that was really, really eye-opening to me about how, like, I just kept saying to myself, like, left-handed people are living in a right-handed world, with kind of this like idea that there's these structures, these things that are already in place, be it the way that you hold a pencil, be it the way that the notebook is positioned, be it the way that scissors are, um, be it the way that the desks are situated. Like you're just like an extra thing that you have to kind of be mindful of in order to just kind of just be yourself. And so I think of neurodiversity as kind of the same thing. So if you've ever been going through life thinking that this is something that you're plagued with, or that is a bad thing, or that you're different and everyone else is normal, then I would really, really like for you to take that out of your vernacular, out of your thoughts, out of yourself, because that is just not true. And in fact, I think that the the individuals that I know who are neurodivergent in different areas see the world in such a different and creative and unique way. They have such a different outlook and are just so intelligent and interesting. So, if that's you, then instead of saying like, sorry, I know that that's a really big challenge, then what I would like to say to you is you're awesome and keep changing the world and for the better. Does anyone else have anything that you wanted to comment? There was a fair amount of activity in the chat. It seems like a lot of folks in the class can kind of relate to this. Did anybody want to add anything? I'm sure that the conversation will continue because it definitely seems like people were engaged and interested. So
Yeah, so I was just looking because up here, Brianna asked, how do I know if I have it? Is there a test to take? Right, there are lots of them online. Obviously, they're not going to be like definitive diagnostic kind of tests, but if you're like, this really does kind of sound like me, yeah, looking at just kind of some basic, am I neurodivergent? Do I have ADHD? Whatever kind of tests just as a way to understand yourself better, I absolutely think is a valid thing to do. So I was looking, I found one, I have not taken this or looked at it closely, but it could be a starting point. It also looks like that web page had some good information just about like what is neurodivergency and stuff like that. So yeah, I think if any of this is resonating with you, but you've never thought about it, or like I am such a huge proponent of like you're never going to go wrong with like researching or learning more about yourself, right? Or thinking more about who you are and what works for you. So yeah, seeking out those kind of resources, absolutely. So yeah, you could try that quiz I put in the chat, or again, just Google and see kind of articles or things like that you find. Or again, you can always shoot me an email. I can throw my email in here if you ever want. Again, I just kind of have my own lived experience, as well as like teaching. So like I am not autistic. I can't speak super specifically to that experience, but yeah, I'm more than happy to talk. And then I have some nice connections to other people because I work in support services. So yeah, it's always great to go and just like learn more about yourself.
That is amazing. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here today.